2 months ago, my wife drove to Knoxville to help our son and his wife get settled after their move. She planned to stay 2 weeks. After 4 days, she stopped answering my calls. On the fifth day, I got in my truck and drove the 3 hours myself. When I turned onto their street and stepped out of the cab, an old man I'd never seen before walked straight toward me from across the road, pointed his finger at me, and said, "You need to call an ambulance, right now, before you go in that house." I've spent 31 years as a homicide detective in Nashville. I know what fear looks like on a person's face. This man was terrified. I called 911 before I even reached the front door. Nothing in my life would ever be the same after that phone call. The drive to Knoxville had taken me longer than usual. I'd stopped twice without meaning to, sitting in gas station parking lots with the engine running, telling myself I was overreacting. Maggie was fine. She was probably just wrapped up in helping Kevin organize the new house. You know how she gets, completely absorbed in a project, phone left charging in the other room. 41 years of marriage, and she still forgot to charge her phone. That was the explanation. That had to be the explanation. But 4 days of silence wasn't like her. Not even a little. Maggie texted me every morning. It was our thing. Had been since Kevin was in middle school and I started working overnight shifts. "Good morning," she'd write. Sometimes with a little heart, sometimes just those 2 words. 41 years. The only times she'd missed were when she was in surgery for her gallbladder back in 2019. And even then she texted me from the recovery room before the anesthesia fully wore off. 4 days of nothing meant something was wrong. I'd told myself other things too. Things about Kevin. He was our only child, born the year I made detective. Maggie had raised him largely on her own during those early years when I was working cases that pulled me away for weeks at a time. She never complained. Kevin was a good kid. Smart, athletic, charming in that easy way some people are just born with. He'd gotten into finance, worked his way up to a regional manager position at an investment firm in Atlanta, then followed a promotion to Knoxville 18 months ago. That's when he met Brittany. I'd liked Brittany at first. She was sharp, driven, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood the social architecture of it. Kevin seemed happier than he'd been in years. They married quickly, maybe too quickly, but Maggie said I was being an overprotective father, and I let it go. The change in Kevin started about 6 months after the wedding. Phone calls that used to be about fishing or college football started drifting toward money. The new house had needed unexpected repairs. Brittany's car had needed a transmission. The investment firm had restructured his bonus structure. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same thing, and then 8 weeks ago, Kevin had asked me something that sat wrong in my stomach for days afterward. "Dad, have you thought about updating your beneficiary designations? You know, with your pension and everything. Brittany's an estate planner by training. She'd be happy to help you and Mom review everything." I was in the garage when he asked me that, changing the oil on Maggie's car. I remember I stopped what I was doing and just stood there with my hands covered in oil, not saying anything for a moment. "We're fine, son," I said. "I know," I just thought. "We're fine." I told Maggie about it that night. She was folding laundry, and she smiled in that patient way she had, the smile that meant she thought I was being dramatic. "He's just being thoughtful," she said. "You know how Brittany is about financial planning. That's how she thinks about everything. Maybe. Or maybe 31 years of working homicides had wired my brain to notice when something felt off about a person's motivation. The question hadn't felt thoughtful. It had felt like reconnaissance. When Maggie left for Knoxville 3 weeks later to help with the move, I kissed her at the door and told her to call me when she got there. She did. We talked for 40 minutes that first night, and she sounded happy. She described the new house, the big kitchen, the way the backyard backed up to a creek. She said Kevin had seemed genuinely glad she was there. The next morning, her text came at 7:14. "Good morning, Frank. Miss you already." The morning after that, nothing. I waited. I called. I texted. I told myself the phone was dead. I called Kevin, who answered on the second ring and said everything was fine. Mom was just tired from the move. She'd call me when she woke up. I called again that evening. Kevin said she was resting. I called the next morning. Kevin said she'd gone out with Brittany. I asked him to have her call me when she got back. She never called. By the fourth morning, I was already loading a bag into my truck. The drive through Tennessee in November is beautiful if you're paying attention. I wasn't paying attention. I drove on autopilot, rehearsing what I would say when I got there, working through scenarios the way I used to work through case files. By the time I turned into Kevin's neighborhood, a quiet residential street in West Knoxville with big oak trees and houses set back from the road, I had convinced myself I was going to feel foolish. I was going to pull up and Maggie was going to open the door and laugh at me, and I was going to be the overprotective husband who couldn't handle 2 weeks alone. I parked at the curb. Kevin's house was a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a large front porch. Nice house. The kind of house that costs more than you'd expect for someone whose bonus structure had supposedly been restructured. I stepped out of the truck, and that's when I saw the old man. He came from the house directly across the street, walking faster than I expected for a man his age, maybe late 70s, thin, wearing a flannel shirt despite the cold. He had the kind of face that had spent a lot of years outdoors, deeply lined, eyes still sharp. He came straight for me without hesitating, like he'd been watching for someone to show up. "You related to the woman in that house?" he asked. "She's my wife. I'm Frank Calloway, Earl Hutchins." He shook my hand briefly, not as a pleasantry. "You need to call an ambulance right now, before you go in there." "What happened?" "3 days ago, I saw your wife through their front window. She was at the kitchen table, and she couldn't hold her head up. I watched for a minute, thinking she was just tired. Then she slid sideways out of the chair and hit the floor." He said it the way a man says something he's been holding for days, steady but tight. "I called across to your son. He came out on the porch and told me she was fine, just had too much wine at dinner. But I looked through that window for another hour, and nobody helped her up. She was just lying there." My hand was already on my phone. "I called 911 anyway," Earl said. "That same afternoon. But your son got to the door before the paramedics did. He told them she was fine, that she'd had a reaction to some new medication, that they'd already spoken to her doctor. He signed something. I don't know what he signed, but they left. They left. They left. And I haven't seen her since. Curtains have been closed. Cars in the driveway. I knocked yesterday morning and your son answered the door and told me my concern wasn't appreciated." The dispatcher picked up before Earl finished his sentence. I identified myself by name and gave the address. I said my wife had been seen unresponsive 3 days ago, and I had reason to believe she needed immediate medical attention. Then I walked to the front door and knocked. Kevin answered. He was 34 years old and had my height, but Maggie's coloring, dark hair, lighter complexion. He looked at me the way you look at someone whose arrival is inconvenient. "Dad, I didn't know you were coming. Where is she?" "She's upstairs resting. She hasn't been." I walked past him. I found Maggie in the guest bedroom on the 2nd floor. She was in bed, blankets pulled up to her chin, and when I turned on the bedside lamp and saw her face, something in my chest seized. She was the color of old chalk. She looked smaller than she had 3 weeks ago, diminished somehow, like something had been slowly taken out of her. Her eyes opened when the light came on, found my face, and the relief on her expression was the worst thing I've ever seen in my life, because it meant she'd been waiting. "Frank." Her voice was barely there. "I'm here. I've got help coming. Something's wrong with me." She tried to sit up and couldn't. "I can't think straight. Everything keeps going sideways." Kevin was in the doorway. "She's been sleeping it off. She had a bad reaction to—" "Don't." I turned and looked at my son, and I used the voice I used in interrogation rooms for 31 years, the one that doesn't invite argument. "Don't say another word." The paramedics arrived 8 minutes later. I stood in the room while they worked, watching Maggie's face, holding her hand when they'd let me. Her blood pressure was low. Her pupils were slow. One of the paramedics, a young woman with a calm, efficient manner, asked me what medications Maggie took. I listed them. The paramedic and her partner exchanged a look I recognized because I'd spent decades watching people try to communicate without words. They took her on a stretcher. I rode in the ambulance. Kevin and Brittany did not follow. The ER at the University of Tennessee Medical Center was fluorescent and loud, and I sat in a plastic chair in a waiting room for 2 hours before a doctor found me. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, unhurried, which I'd learned over the years meant either the situation had stabilized or he was about to deliver something difficult. He asked if I was Mr. Calloway, and then he asked me to come with him. The room he took me to was quiet. He sat across from me and folded his hands and said, "Your wife has a significant amount of benzodiazepines in her system, more than would be consistent with normal prescribed use. Her dosage levels suggest she's been receiving elevated amounts over an extended period, several days at minimum. Benzodiazepines, sedatives, the family of drugs that include Xanax, Valium, Klonopin. She's not prescribed any benzodiazepines," I said. "No, we confirmed that from her medical records." He held my gaze. "Mr. Calloway, the levels we're looking at, combined with what appears to be inadequate nutrition over that same period, her body was shutting down. If she'd gone another day without intervention, we'd be having a very different conversation." The room went very quiet. "Who knew she was with you?" he asked. "My son, his wife. We're going to need to contact law enforcement." "I spent 31 years in law enforcement," I said. "Make the call." Maggie was admitted to the ICU. I sat beside her bed through the night, watching the monitors, listening to her breathe. Around 2 in the morning, she woke up enough to talk. "How long have I been here?" she asked. "A few hours." "You're safe." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling. "The tea," she said finally. "What tea?" "Every night, Brittany made me tea before bed. Chamomile," she said. "It was sweet. I didn't think anything of it." She turned her head toward me. The second night, I fell asleep at the kitchen table. Kevin helped me up to bed. I thought I was just exhausted from the move, but the next morning I couldn't get up. My legs wouldn't work right. And then it was like she searched for words, like being underwater. I could hear things, but I couldn't respond the way I wanted to. "You tried to call for help." I dropped my phone the second day. I couldn't reach it. I kept trying to tell Kevin something was wrong, that I needed a doctor. He said I just needed rest. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes did. He patted my hand and told me to sleep. Frank, our son, patted my hand while I was lying there and told me to sleep. She didn't cry. Maggie has always been braver than me in most of the ways that count. "The neighbor called 911, I told her. "The man across the street, the older man? I saw him once from the window the first day. His name is Earl. He's the reason you're here." She closed her eyes and didn't say anything for a while. I held her hand in both of mine and listened to the monitors. The detective who came the next morning was a woman named Sergeant Patricia Ware, Knox County Sheriff's Office. 40-something, no nonsense, the kind of investigator who listened more than she spoke. I respected that immediately. I told her everything. Kevin's financial questions, the 4 days of silence, what Earl had witnessed, what Maggie had told me about the nightly tea. Ware took notes without expression, asked clarifying questions at precise moments, and when I was done, she looked at me with the frank assessment of one professional to another. "Your son and daughter-in-law," she said. "Do they know your wife is here?" I called Kevin from the ambulance. He said he hoped she felt better. Ware's pen paused on her notepad. "He said he hoped she felt better," I repeated. "We'll bring them in for a conversation," she said. "In the meantime, I'd like your wife's account as soon as she's able." Kevin and Brittany came to the hospital that afternoon. I saw them in the hallway before they saw me, and I watched them for a moment the way I used to watch subjects through two-way glass. They walked close together. Brittany was talking quietly, and Kevin was nodding, and there was something about the quality of that conversation, the contained, focused nature of it, that I recognized as preparation. They were getting their story straight. I stepped into the hallway and they stopped. "Dad." Kevin put his arms around me briefly. He smelled like cologne he hadn't been wearing that morning. "How is she?" "She's going to be okay. Thank God." He shook his head. "We had no idea she was that sick. She kept saying she was fine, that she just needed rest. You know how Mom is. She hates making a fuss." Brittany touched my arm. "We're so relieved, Frank. When you called from the ambulance, I was so scared." I looked at them both. Brittany met my eyes without hesitation. Kevin met them for about 2 seconds and then looked at the floor. The doctors found sedatives in her system, I said. High doses. She hadn't been prescribed any. A beat of silence. That's frightening, Brittany said. Could it be something she accidentally took? From one of our cabinets? We do have some medication at the house, and if she mistakenly... She was making herself tea every night, I said. Chamomile, with honey. Another beat. Shorter this time. Right, Brittany said. I made it for her. Just a little something to help her sleep. She mentioned she'd been having trouble since the time change. Did you put anything in it? Of course not, Frank. What are you? The doctors will be running tests on the tea bags. They took samples from the kitchen. This was not strictly true at that moment. It would become true within the hour. But I watched Brittany's face carefully as I said it, and I saw something move behind her eyes, quick as a fish under water. I think we should wait and talk to the doctors together, she said smoothly. As a family, Kevin was still looking at the floor. I called my friend Ray Dalton that evening. Ray ran his own investigative firm after retiring from the FBI 15 years ago, forensic accounting his specialty. I'd sent him work over the years, and he'd done the same for me. I told him I needed everything on Kevin Mitchell Calloway and Brittany Ann Calloway, née Shreve. Finances, debts, assets, anything that moved in the last 18 months. Ray called me back in 2 days. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria when my phone rang, drinking coffee that tasted like hot cardboard and staring at nothing. I picked up on the first ring. Frank, Ray said, your son is in a lot of trouble. He walked me through it. Kevin had taken out a personal loan for $60,000 8 months ago against a financial product he'd managed for a client. The loan was irregular, potentially fraudulent, and the firm had begun an internal investigation 3 months ago. He'd borrowed money from 2 private lenders. On top of that, $45,000 combined, both past due. His credit cards were maxed. Their combined consumer debt was sitting just over $120,000. There's more, Ray said. 6 weeks before your wife went to Knoxville, Brittany called a life insurance company. She asked hypothetical questions about claim processing timelines and beneficiary designations, specifically around a policy for a Margaret Ann Calloway. I set my coffee cup down very carefully. She asked how quickly a claim pays out, Ray continued, and whether a beneficiary needed to be present during hospitalization to file. Maggie's life insurance policy. The one she'd taken out 20 years ago when Kevin was in high school. $400,000. It wouldn't cover their debts and then some. But combined with my pension and our retirement accounts, which Kevin had positioned himself to access with his beneficiary question, it came close to everything. They hadn't planned to inherit. They'd planned to collect. I drove to the police station the next morning and sat across from Sergeant Ware and laid it out the way I used to lay out cases for prosecutors. Motive, timeline, opportunity, the financial desperation, Brittany's call to the insurance company, the nightly tea, 4 days of a woman being sedated in a bedroom while her phone sat on a nightstand 10 feet away, and her husband called and got told she was resting. Ware listened to all of it, and then she said, "We've already subpoenaed their pharmacy records. We're looking for a dispensing source for the benzodiazepines. The tea mug your wife used is in the lab. When will you have results?" "A week, maybe less. In the meantime, they stay in Knoxville. I've asked them not to travel." The week that followed was one of the longest of my life. I slept in a chair beside Maggie's bed for the first 4 nights, then in a hotel room 2 blocks from the hospital after she made me leave because my back was going out. She improved steadily. Her thinking cleared. She could walk to the bathroom and back without help. She ate real meals. I watched color come back into her face, like watching a photograph develop. Kevin called twice. I let it go to voicemail. Brittany didn't call. Earl Hutchins came to the hospital on the 4th day. He stood in the doorway of Maggie's room with a grocery bag of oranges and a look on his face that was simultaneously awkward and determined, the look of a man who was going to do the right thing even though it made him uncomfortable. Maggie saw him from the bed and immediately reached out her hand. "You came," she said. "Just thought I'd check." He stayed near the door, turning the grocery bag by its handles. Didn't want to intrude. "You saved my life," Maggie said. "You're not intruding." Earl sat in the chair I'd pulled up, and they talked for almost an hour while I stood near the window and listened. Earl was a retired school teacher, 7th grade history, had taught in Knox County for 38 years. His wife had passed 4 years ago. He'd moved to that house in 1987. He said he'd watched that street for 37 years, and he knew what normal looked like, and what he'd seen through that window 3 weeks ago wasn't normal. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me, he said. Old man looking through his neighbor's window. I thought maybe I was seeing things wrong. You weren't, Maggie said. I know that now. He looked down at his hands. I should have done more. I should have pushed harder when the paramedics came. You called. That's what mattered. He left the oranges on the windowsill and shook my hand on the way out and said if there was anything he could do, anything at all. I told him there was one thing. I asked if he'd be willing to give a statement to the sheriff's office about what he'd witnessed. He said he'd already given one. He'd gone in on his own, 2 days before Maggie arrived at the hospital, and told them everything. That's the kind of person Earl Hutchins was. Sergeant Ware called me on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Maggie's admission. I was in the hotel room getting dressed when my phone rang, and I knew from the first word of her voice that something had broken open. Lab results came back on the mug, she said. High concentration of crushed alprazolam, ground fine enough to dissolve in liquid. Alprazolam, Xanax. The generic form can be purchased in large quantities through certain channels. Dissolved in sweet tea, it would be undetectable. We found the source, Ware continued. Online pharmacy, ships internationally, prescription not required. The order was placed 5 weeks before your wife's visit. It was placed using a credit card in your daughter-in-law's name, delivered to a P.O. box registered in her name 2 towns over from their previous address. That's premeditation. By several weeks. And Frank, Brittany's search history, we got a warrant for her laptop. Searches starting 6 weeks before your wife's visit. How much Xanax causes unconsciousness. Sedative overdose symptoms. How long does alprazolam stay in system? Can sleeping medication cause death if untreated? I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. We're filing charges, Ware said. Attempted murder, 1st degree for both of them. Conspiracy. Elder abuse under Tennessee statute. Warrants will be issued this afternoon. They were arrested the next morning. I watched it on the local news from Maggie's hospital room. She'd been moved to a regular room by then, sitting up in bed with her reading glasses on, looking more like herself every day. The coverage was brief, 30 seconds. Exterior footage of Kevin and Brittany being walked to a patrol car. Kevin's head was down. Brittany stared straight ahead. Don't look if you don't want to, I said. I want to. Maggie watched the screen until the segment ended. I need to see it. What I hadn't expected was the media. Kevin and Brittany had hired an attorney named Douglas Fain within 48 hours of their arrest, a man whose primary practice seemed to be the rehabilitation of client narratives in front of television cameras. Within a week, he'd arranged interviews on 2 local stations and a regional podcast. The story that emerged bore almost no resemblance to reality. According to Fain's carefully packaged version, Maggie had been struggling with anxiety and sleep issues for years, self-medicating secretly. Kevin and Brittany had grown concerned during her visit and had gently tried to help her cut back, which was why they hadn't wanted paramedics involved. They hadn't wanted to embarrass her. Their absence from the hospital in the early days was explained as shock and fear, the behavior of 2 young people overwhelmed by an unexpected family crisis. Brittany's pharmaceutical searches were explained as research after noticing Maggie's symptoms, an attempt to understand what was happening to her. We love Margaret, Brittany said on camera, her voice measured and sorrowful. What's happening to us right now? Being accused of this by her own husband, it's devastating. We just want her to get well. We want the truth to come out. The calls started the next week. Old friends, colleagues from the department, people I'd known for 20 years. All of them gentle, all of them careful, all of them asking questions that had doubt underneath. Frank, have you considered that maybe Maggie's memory of those days isn't fully accurate? Sedatives can affect recall. Frank, I'm not saying I believe them, but could there be any chance she was having some kind of episode you didn't know about? I understood what was happening. I'd watched it happen in courtrooms. The defense strategy wasn't to prove innocence. It was to manufacture enough uncertainty that a jury couldn't be sure. Reasonable doubt wasn't found. It was constructed. And Fain was a skilled architect. I didn't engage with it. I'd spent 3 decades watching people try to talk their way out of evidence. Evidence didn't care about narratives. My attorney, a woman named Susan Park, who specialized in civil litigation and who had the temperament of someone who had never lost an argument she considered winnable, filed a civil lawsuit 12 days after the arrest. Attempted murder, intentional infliction of emotional distress, medical costs. The suit detailed everything: the insurance inquiry, the pharmacy order, the search history, the financial motive laid out in precise, documented terms. The lawsuit froze every asset Kevin and Brittany owned: their house, their cars, their joint accounts, all of it locked in legal holding while the case worked through the courts. Kevin called me 2 days after the filing, and for a moment I thought I was going to hear something real from him, some crack in the performance, some trace of the boy I'd coached through his first baseball season and helped move into his first apartment. "You're going to destroy us," he said. "Mom would never want this. Your mother is sitting 20 feet from where I'm standing right now, Kevin, getting physical therapy for the muscle weakness your wife's medication caused. You can ask her what she wants." Silence. "She was going to die," I said. "You knew that. You watched it happen, and you made sure help didn't come. That is a thing you did. And now you're going to answer for it. That's all this is." I hung up. The case cracked open 6 weeks after the arrest, and it cracked from the inside. Ware called me on a Sunday afternoon to tell me they'd separated Kevin and Brittany for a second round of questioning, and the stories had diverged. Not significantly at first, small inconsistencies, a timeline that didn't quite match, a sequence of events that contradicted each other in minor ways. The kind of gaps that appear when 2 people have memorized a script but aren't sure exactly where the other one landed on a given detail. They offered Kevin a deal: full cooperation, complete testimony, reduced charges in exchange for a sentencing recommendation. "He's thinking about it," Ware told me. 3 days later, word apparently reached Brittany about the plea offer. She retained a separate attorney that afternoon and filed a motion claiming that Kevin had been psychologically controlling throughout their marriage, that she had participated in what happened out of fear, that the entire plan had originated with him, and she had been too afraid to refuse. Kevin found out about the motion within 48 hours. He accepted the deal on a Wednesday. His deposition lasted 7 hours. Ware shared the summary with me afterward, and I read it twice, sitting in my truck outside the hotel, because I couldn't do it anywhere near Maggie. Kevin described the plan as originating from Brittany approximately 4 months before Maggie's visit, after Kevin had told her about the insurance policy during an argument about their finances. He described Brittany researching sedative compounds over a period of weeks, selecting alprazolam because of its availability and the speed at which it could be dissolved. He described her ordering it, collecting it, bringing it to Knoxville. He described, in a voice his attorney noted was flat and effectless throughout, standing in the hallway of the guest room on the second night, while Brittany added the dissolved medication to a mug of tea, watching her carry it upstairs. He described hearing his mother say she didn't feel right. He described Brittany telling him to keep the neighbor away from the windows. He described watching the paramedics load his mother onto a stretcher 3 days later and not moving from the doorway. "I told myself she'd be okay," he said in the recording, according to the summary Ware shared. "I kept telling myself somebody would help her in time, and we'd still have a way out of the debt, and nobody would be able to prove what we did. I told myself a lot of things." He was 28 years into telling himself things. Brittany's trial was set for 4 months after the arrest. With Kevin's testimony, the laboratory evidence, the financial records, the search history, Earl Hutchins's eyewitness account, and Maggie's own statement, the outcome was not something the defense could reasonably contest. What Fain could do, and what he did, was attempt to minimize. His closing argument centered on Brittany's claimed coercion, on her fear of Kevin, on the idea that she had been a participant rather than an architect. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of elder abuse. guilty of criminal poisoning under Tennessee's statute. Brittany's face when the verdict was read was not the face of someone who was surprised. It was the face of someone whose calculation had finally come out wrong and who was trying to decide what to do with that. She looked at Kevin, sitting across the courtroom as a witness for the prosecution, and the look they exchanged lasted about 2 seconds before both of them looked away. Her sentencing came 6 weeks later. The judge was a woman in her 60s who had been on the Knox County bench for 15 years and who read her statement with the careful, precise anger of someone who had chosen her words over a long period of time. You purchased a sedative compound online for the specific purpose of incapacitating your husband's mother, she said. You administered it to her over multiple days while she was a guest in your home, trusting you as family. You watched her become unable to stand, unable to communicate, unable to call for help. You turned away first responders when they came. You left her alone and left the state. The only reason Margaret Calloway is alive today is because a retired school teacher across the street trusted what he saw with his own eyes over what your husband told him. She paused. 24 years. You will serve a minimum of 20 before you are eligible for parole consideration. The gavel fell. Kevin's 8-year sentence, negotiated as part of his cooperation agreement, was delivered in a separate proceeding 2 weeks later. He would be eligible for early release after 6 years. I sat in the back of the courtroom for that one, and I tried to feel something identifiable. Anger seemed too simple for what was in front of me. Grief was closer, but even grief implies something lost. And I think I'd lost Kevin somewhere before any of this happened, before Brittany, before the debt, in some shift that had occurred gradually and that I hadn't recognized until it was complete. What I felt, mostly, was tired. Maggie was doing her physical therapy 3 times a week by the time both sentences were delivered. Her strength had come back significantly. The memory issues the doctors had warned about had mostly resolved, though she occasionally lost the thread of a sentence and had to stop and find it again, and there were 2 or 3 words she'd always been confident with that now gave her slight trouble. Whether that was from the sedation or just from being 61 years old, nobody could say for certain. She didn't come to either sentencing. She said she'd seen enough. We drove back to Nashville in late February, on a clear, cold morning that smelled like thawing ground. Maggie rode with her head against the window for the first hour, watching Tennessee go by, and then she turned and looked at me. Do you think he's sorry? I think he's sorry it didn't work. She considered that. Maybe. But sometimes I think about the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and tell me they were flowers. And I think that boy must be somewhere in there still. He might be. And then I think about lying on that floor and not being able to reach my phone. She turned back to the window. And then I stopped thinking about dandelions. I reached over and held her hand for the rest of the drive. We went to see Earl Hutchins before we left Knoxville. Maggie had insisted. We drove to his house on a Saturday morning, and he answered the door in his flannel shirt, looking startled, the way a man who isn't used to being visited looks when someone knocks. Maggie had baked a pound cake. Earl stood there, holding it with the careful expression of someone trying not to show how much something means to him. You didn't have to do that, he said. I did, Maggie said. I really did. He let us in, and we sat at his kitchen table and drank coffee, and he showed us photographs of his wife, who had been a music teacher, and Maggie told him about the 31 years I'd spent in homicide, which Earl found considerably more interesting than I expected. He asked me questions about cases, real questions, the kind that reflected genuine curiosity rather than morbid fascination. He told me about a former student of his who'd become a detective in Memphis. We sat there for almost 2 hours. When we stood up to leave, Earl walked us to the door. And on the porch, he stopped and looked at Maggie with an expression that had some difficulty in it. I wasn't sure anyone would come, he said, after you went in the ambulance. I watched that house for days, waiting for someone to come and thinking maybe nobody would. They would have come eventually, I said. Maybe. He shook his head slightly, but I wasn't sure, and that seemed wrong to me. Somebody ought to be sure. I shook his hand. Maggie hugged him, and he stood there for a moment with his arms out, and then put them around her, the careful hug of a man who hadn't been hugged in a while. We wrote him a letter when we got home, not a check, the way some people would have done it, because Earl Hutchins was not a man who would have been comfortable with a check. Just a letter. Maggie wrote it longhand on her good stationery, 4 pages, and I signed it at the bottom, and we said everything in it that needed to be said. He wrote back. He's written 3 times since then. I have the letters in my desk. The civil case settled in early spring, a symbolic settlement with nothing to collect. Kevin and Brittany had declared bankruptcy. The house was in foreclosure. The financial wreckage of their scheme had consumed everything they owned, and what remained was legal debt that would follow them for years. The settlement existed as a document, a permanent and public record of what had been done and what it had cost. Maggie and I updated our wills in March. Everything goes to the University of Tennessee's nursing program, to a food bank in Nashville that Maggie has volunteered with for 15 years, and to a small scholarship fund we've established in the name of Earl Hutchins for students pursuing degrees in education. Earl doesn't know about the scholarship yet. We're going to tell him in person the next time we see him. Not a dollar to Kevin. Not a dollar to any descendant of Kevin's. The thing they tried to kill for will go somewhere else, somewhere it can become something good. Last month, a letter arrived at our house in Kevin's handwriting. I recognized it before I opened it, the particular way he forms his capital letters, something he'd had since grade school. I sat with it unopened for about 10 minutes on the back porch, in the late afternoon light that was just starting to have some warmth in it again. Then I opened it. 4 pages, an apology, a series of explanations, an account of what had happened to him, and how he'd gotten from the boy I'd raised to the man who stood in a hallway while his mother lay sedated on a floor. He blamed Brittany. He blamed the debt. He blamed a version of himself that he described with apparent sincerity as no longer existing. He asked if there was any path, any at all, back to something between us. I read it once. I read it a second time. I thought about what Maggie had said in the car, about the boy with the dandelions, about the floor and the phone. I thought about 31 years of sitting across from people who had done terrible things and then constructed elaborate stories about why those things weren't really their fault, or weren't entirely their fault, or were understandable given the circumstances. I had heard 10,000 versions of that story. I knew every way it was told. I folded the letter back into its envelope. I set it on the porch railing and I sat there until the light was gone, thinking about nothing in particular, listening to the neighborhood settle into evening. Then I took the letter inside and put it through the shredder. Some things you grieve for. Some things you simply close the door on, and you don't stand there listening for a sound from the other side. You just walk away from the door, and you keep walking, and you hold tightly to what you still have, and you let that be enough. Maggie was in the kitchen when I came back inside, something on the stove that smelled like the soup she's made every winter since we were married. She looked up when I came in, and she could tell from my face that the letter had been from Kevin, because after 41 years, she can always tell. "Okay?" she asked. "I'm okay." She went back to stirring. I sat down at the kitchen table and watched her move around the kitchen, and outside the window the stars were starting to come out one by one over Nashville, and the soup smelled like every winter we'd survived together, and for the first time in months, I sat in my own home and felt the particular peace of a man who did the right thing when it mattered, who protected what needed protecting, and who came out the other side still holding the things that were worth holding. That was enough. That was more than enough. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Eclipse Vengeance, and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are right now. And if you've ever had someone unexpected step in and protect you when you needed it most, I'd love to hear about it below. There's a video appearing on your screen now with another story that I think you'll want to hear.